Nachmanides. Tying together the word shakan, God's abode, and mishkan, from Sinai to the infrastructure.
Okay, that looks like that's up and running. That over there. Okay. All right. Looks like the technology's in place. Now we just give it a minute for people to log in.
Good.
That is one of the reasons why I love that commentator's Bible.
Yeah.
A great way of bringing together some of the highlights of the different commentaries. Just give it one more minute. A lot of people logged into YouTube, which is nice. Got our Zoom crew as well. All right, that's about enough of a buffer. Let's go ahead and get things moving then. So good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our discussion of this old house. We are into building mode. The last couple weeks we have had the loftiness of Mount Sinai, as well as the different mitzvot, the commandments in Mishpatim, and all of that has been amazing and very practical in a theoretical sense. If it happens, do this, you need to do this. But all of it also has left behind very little physical evidence of the encounter with God and of our mission. It's not surprising then that in Terumah, in the next section of the Torah, that we set about the building of that physical presence. One of the difficulties, however, with this section and similar sections in both the Torah and the rest of Tanakh is that many of the words that are used here are relatively rare. We don't talk about general building and construction all that often. You might be led to to think I am not quite correct here, because we're going to spend quite a few chapters throughout the rest of the book of Exodus talking about construction. It may seem overwhelming in the short term. However, those words are all the same, meaning that we are not being provided additional context, additional structure, or seeing those words in numerous other places that would give us a better understanding of them. And many of them are words that did not persist in common usage following the biblical period. That means that we have words that are a little bit less clear to understand than many of the other words that we have. Now, it might seem strange that it's harder to understand certain words like tachash than it is to understand a word like ahava, which is usually translated as love. However, we simply have a lot more data on one of those than the other. But that does not mean that we cannot have a useful conversation in trying to understand what some of these other words mean, and also what the meaning of those other words are. So that is going to be our focus for today. With that in mind, we're going to begin Parashat Terumah with chapter 25 in the book of Shemot, book of Exodus, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the Israelite people to bring me gifts. you shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart so moves him. Just a reminder, although it won't be the focus for today, that this is a very important caveat, that this is not a levied tax, unlike the half shekel, which we'll talk about later and read about last week during the special maftir. This is instead a voluntary donation where people are bringing what they want. However, what they are being asked to give is limited. So this is a very important balance here. God is asking the people to give if they want, but if they give, they have to give what is needed. People should not be showing up at the Mishkan and handing over any old bits of rubbish. They should be giving only what is asked for. As I've often said to my own kids, it's not helping if it isn't what's asked for. It's not helping if you're just doing what you want rather than what the other person wants. So in this case, we are being asked to help if we want to, but to do so in a special way. And both parts of that equation are absolutely important, essential, and should continue in our own personal lives as well. So let's get to God's wish list, his bridal registry, if you will, as we often metaphorically consider Sinai to have been our wedding and the mountain itself our chuppah, as we've talked about at other times. And these are the gifts that you shall accept from them: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, dolphin skins, and acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil, and for the aromatic incense, lapis lazuli, and other stones for setting for the ephod and the breastpiece. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. And a very important and famous phrase that God is having us build the Mishkan, not so that we can dwell inside, not that he can dwell inside it. God is not going to be contained within the structure, but that it will be a symbol of God's presence among us, betocham, right? That God will be among us, among them, meaning the children of Israel, not in it, meaning the tabernacle. Exactly as I show you the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, so shall you make it. We've also talked in great length at other times. One of the reasons for the very detailed list of construction here was precisely to avoid us making whatever we felt like. That we were going to build something that God would constrain, and that this would hopefully avoid the excesses of idolatry that often came with a physical construction in the honor of God. We saw too much in both Egypt as well as Canaanite architecture, and really we've seen in buildings around the world that people often drift a little bit off course when it comes to building something that is in God's honor. That can sometimes detract from actually doing something in God's honor, meaning carrying out of God's will. So God gives us lots of instructions here to make sure that we do only that which is asked, nothing more, nothing less. All right, so that's going to be our launching point. Do we have any questions before we dive in to our specific questions?
Rabbi, in verse number 9, is that also an affirmation that there is an oral Torah?
Indeed, this is one of the verses that is used. Even though this particular verse doesn't contain information that we need personally on a daily basis, unlike verses like slaughtering our animals, this is another proof, if you will, that all of the information needed could not be given in written form. That instead there had to be some additional representation that was made known to Moses and to those that were building in order for it to be done correctly. And indeed, that is often used as an explanation of why the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, is an essential component of the original giving of the Torah. If people are interested in more of that, please check out the Pathway to Judaism class that I do every year for those interested in Judaism, whether to fill in their information or to potentially convert. And I always make sure that I believe the third class of each session talks about our different texts and sources. And I go into much more detail about the oral Torah and its necessity during that class. Any other questions or comments? All right, so let's dive in. So we're going to begin with Rashi, because Rashi is a great place to start. Just a little reminder for those of you that are not as familiar with our many different commentators, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, also known as Rashi, it's an acronym of his name, lived about 1,000 years ago, and his commentary is considered quite authoritative, partly because 80%, the estimate that was given to me by my professors, of what he says is taken directly from the earlier teachings of the earliest rabbis. So he is not inventing or interpreting in his own way. He is instead simply trying to take what was scattered around rabbinic literature and organize it verse by verse to make it easily accessible. Additionally, he tried to bring verses on the whole, and there is a whole field of studying why Rashi chose what he chose from the great buffet of different commentaries of the early rabbis. But on the whole, he chose interpretations that would help you understand a verse within its immediate context. Occasionally, he will bring additional insights that are a little bit more broadly interpretations, but mostly what he was trying to do was focus on understanding that verse right there and what it meant. And indeed, he gets into that conversation of what we are going to do with this whole things that we are building. So some of the things you noticed was goat hair. Another thing you noticed that we were building with was dolphin skin. Well, he explains later on, for that roofing of goat's hair, make still another covering of ram skin dyed red, and above this also a covering of tachash skins. Now, tachash is the word that is being translated in our JPS, Jewish Publication Society translation, as dolphin. We're going to try and figure out whether it's actually a dolphin in a minute, but for the moment, and quite often, I'm just going to refer to it as tachash. This is one of those words I mentioned that is hard to nail down because it does not show up all that often, and when it does show up, it gives us very few clues as to what it might mean. But here we are being given at least a clue by its purpose. So Rashi is saying that you have this roof of goat's hair, that's the actual tent of the tabernacle itself. Above that, you have a covering of the ram skin that is dyed red. That would be like a leather umbrella over the whole Mishkan. And then above that, as some sort of top, you would have a tachash skin, this mystery animal's skin. These uppermost covers, however, covered the roof only. That is to say, they were not hanging over the sides. Their length being 30 cubits and their width 10, meaning it went the length of the Mishkan, but it didn't go down the sides of the Mishkan. It was just a strip across the top. This, at least, is the opinion of Rabbi Nehemiah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there was only one cover, half of it being made of ram skins dyed red and half of it of the tachash skins. So they both agree that this tachash skin was part of the covering, as it's clear from chapter 26 in Exodus, but they're arguing about whether it was the centerpiece and then the ram skin on the side, or whether the ram skin covered the whole thing and then you had the tachash go over the top of it as well. Now, since this is a smaller amount, one can assume that this animal, this skin must have been somehow better in some purpose for that particular position and might also have been a little bit more scarce or rare. Otherwise, why not use it for the whole thing? So we do have some clues that this is not just your run-of-the-mill goat skin. It's not your run-of-the-mill sheep skin or even cow skin. We know those words very clearly from other places. But it seems to have been something more exotic, both by its unique word as well as by its limited function here. Everyone up to speed with Rashi then? Okay. To try and narrow down the identity of this mystery animal, let's turn to the Talmud. The Gemara asks, what is the halakhic conclusion reached about the matter of the tachash that existed in the days of Moses? So they have a question, because the rabbis of the Talmud, who lived more than 1,000 plus years after the Exodus, they also were confused by this word of tachash. Rabbi Ella said, that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, that Rabbi Meir used to say, we're going back a few generations in tradition of interpretation, the tachash that existed in the days of Moses was a creature unto itself. And the sages did not determine whether it was a type of undomesticated animal or a type of domesticated animal. Okay, so what they are saying here, this chain of tradition, is that stop trying to figure out what the tachash was, because it wasn't anything you've ever seen. It is something that existed only for this purpose, that it lived, God created it just so that it would be there when Moses needed it to be slaughtered in order to use its skin for the covering, and after that, it's gone. It was a singular, unique being who did not continue to propagate beyond that period, and therefore we cannot determine anything. Now, they did hypothesize that it had a single horn on its forehead, and this tachash happened to come to Moses for the moment while the tabernacle was being built, and he made the covering for the tabernacle from it. And from then on, the tachash was suppressed and is no longer found, meaning it went into either hiding, or in modern parlance, you could say it went extinct, maybe perhaps being the last of its kind. Now, this interpretation of the Talmud throws a large monkey wrench into the interpretation of the of JPS, of dolphin, because whether it's an undomesticated animal or a domesticated animal, those terms in the original terminology of the rabbis cannot refer to a sea creature. They are referring to animals that walk along the ground. So whether it was a bear, or whether it was a lion, or whether it was a deer, those would all be possible undomesticated animals, or whether it was a goat or a sheep or a cow, those would be domesticated animals. But a dolphin would fall into neither category, according to this discussion. So certainly these rabbis did not believe that it was an aquatic mammal, that it could not have been a dolphin according to their interpretation. But this other idea of it no longer being around is, I think, a much more interesting glimpse into the rabbinic mind. The idea that this tachash is such a unique term used in the Torah, and really used only in a couple of places, as we're going to see, that they simply do not believe that it would have continued to propagate its species. If it had, they would have known about it. They'd be able to point to it and explain it. Now, that's also a little bit of a difficult conclusion for them to reach in general, simply because of its unavailability, because there are other animals that are also known as being rare or singular. And the rabbis did not necessarily claim that they were no longer around. So there might be some other understanding that is going into this. Questions on the Talmud before we see where else this term tachash shows up and what it might teach us? All right. So we're going to turn to Ibn Ezra, who tells us that this tachash is from a creature that was known in those days. So he's not arguing that it's disappeared. He's simply saying it was something they were familiar with. And as it is written, and gave you sandals of tachash to wear. In Ezekiel, we are given a line that God gave us tachash sandals. Therefore, it was already known, reasons Ibn Ezra. It must have been that the people who came out of Egypt knew what a tachash was, because God had given us the sandals made of these things. And therefore, it shouldn't have been a surprise to them. But for us, yeah, it's not known to us, but that doesn't necessarily make it a completely bizarre creature. The quote from Ezekiel in full reads, I clothed you with embroidered garments and gave you sandals of dolphin leather, again in JPS they choose to call with dolphin, to wear, and wound fine linen about your head and dressed you in silks. So the full line seems to also imply that whatever we used for the covering of the Mishkan was also used to cover our feet. And even Ezra says that just must have been something they had that we don't. Doesn't seem to go quite as far. Now, Rashi in that same location in Ezekiel goes with a different interpretation. Rather than defining tachash as dolphin, he defines tachash as a badger. I shod you with badger, meaning badger's skin. Now, there's no explanation given of why badger was used as the definition at that point. However, if you look into the Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Bible, it uses a very different phrase. Rather than identifying a particular animal, Targum Yonatan says, "And I put shoes of glory on your feet." Now, the idea here would be that the shoes that were put on are shoes that would have been spectacular. They would have been shoes that gave great honor and great status to the person wearing it. Much like the coat that was given to Joseph showed everyone that he was an amazing person because of what he was able to wear. So too, apparently, according to the Aramaic translation, these shoes, the important thing to know about it is that they were spectacular. That these were something that when you saw them, you would be impressed by, which would certainly make sense as why it might also have been chosen as the covering for the Mikdash itself. Questions or comments? Okay. Let's move on then to Rabbeinu Bachya, giving us a bit of a summary so far, as well as taking us forward. The tachash was some kind of free-roaming beast. Our sages, as we saw up in the Talmud, are of the opinion that the tachash was an animal which existed only during that generation and had a single horn on its forehead. Its whole function was to have its skin serve as one of the coverings of the tabernacle. Apparently, the color of their skin was so beautiful that it was not to be used again for secular purposes, so that God allowed this animal to become extinct as soon as it had fulfilled its purpose. Our sages on that same daf meaning page of Talmud, explained that the fact that it had a horn on its forehead was proof that it was ritually pure, a ritually pure animal, meaning kosher in the vernacular. According to our tradition, the ox offered by Adam as a sacrifice also had only a single horn on its forehead. This is based on Psalm 92, that will please the Lord more than oxen, than a bull with a horn and hooves. It's an unusual bit of grammar here. The singular of the word horn in that verse means that a particular bull had only one horn. So therefore, since it was used as a one-horned bull for a sacrifice, we can understand then by deduction that it was a ritually pure animal, since non-ritually pure animals could not be offered as sacrifices. At any rate, unless the tachash had been ritually pure, none of its parts would have been qualified for use in the tabernacle. He goes on to claim that everything involved in the tabernacle is also ritually pure, and therefore we would also believe that any of the skins used would have been ritually pure as well. Now that means that a dolphin is also disqualified, because a dolphin cannot be a dolphin is not a ritually pure animal. Seeing that the tachash had so many colors, Onkelos translated it as proud of its being multicolored. Again, sort of hearkening back to the Targum Yonatan, which is the translation of the rest of the Tanakh, as opposed to Onkelos, which is of the Torah. The idea here of being a spectacularly colored skin seems to be a running theme of how our ancestors understood it. Now, to try and reconcile, and I put this out of order, but to try and reconcile this idea of this being this amazing, colorful animal that lived only at one point and who never could have had a secular use, Siftei Chachamim wants to help us understand why the section in Ezekiel, which talks about our shoes being made out of this tachash skin, what that could possibly mean. And they argue that the tachash of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel, was a species of impure animal called a tala ilan. So their argument there is that don't think of this as being the same one. Think of this as being a different animal with the same name. Now, if that sounds a little confusing to you, how many people have ever heard of a grizzly bear? All right, hopefully everybody's raising their hand. How many people have heard of a panda bear? Hopefully people are raising your hands. How many people have heard of a koala bear? Hopefully you're raising your hands. How many people have heard of a water bear? Probably not quite as many, but all four of those animals are not only completely different in their type and style, but they are not even in the same families of animals. But in English, we happen to use the word bear for all of them, or at least for part of their name. So too, the word tachash could refer to multiple different animals, and we have to use clues to understand what is meant by each in different situations. It's much easier if you have pictures and diagrams, even easier if you have a living person that can explain it to you, who's actually seen them and knows the nomenclature, their usage in context in the biblical period. But we are left trying to sift through the clues that we still have. Okay, any other questions or comments before we press on with another alternative of what the tachash might have been? Yes.
There is a dolphin that is a fish.
Yes,
and it is, I mean, not that it was roaming around, but the dolphin fish, not the mammal, but the dolphin fish is multicolored. It's like a rainbow when you pick it from the sea. And I'm trying to think of an animal that would be multicolored like it, that maybe caused that confusion between dolphin fish. I mean, maybe that's where they got confused, because you're talking about some kind of animal that has multicolors to it. Right?
Indeed, some have proposed that it was either a dolphin fish or other types of colorful fish that are kosher animals, even if fish were never offered on the altar. I've heard somebody even try to shoehorn the narwhal into this by saying the single horn narwhal, which is a bit of a stretch. Single horn animals have often also come in as an overlap of what might have been referring to a rhinoceros, and as part of what a unicorn might have looked like. So there are a number of other contenders out there, but they have a difficulty providing the coloring, since all of them are fairly drab as far as the color of their skin goes.
Right.
But we are going to see another example of one that, even though the quote that I'm bringing is discounting it, at least meets a few of the criteria in a way that might make it a candidate. All right. So the author of the article published in Kochavei Yitzchak similarly regards the giraffe as a kosher species. But rather than identifying it with the zemer, which is another term that might have been biblically used to refer to a giraffe, he somewhat fancifully identifies it as the tachash, the animal whose skin was used in the construction of the tabernacle, as described in Exodus 25. So we have this opinion in this other article that perhaps the tachash was a giraffe. Now, we can try and understand what his thinking would be by deduction. The giraffe is indeed a kosher species. That is to say, it has a cloven hoof and it chews its cud. The giraffe does have what appears to be a single horn on its head. If you look at the little pointy bits that stick up at the top of the giraffe from the side, they do indeed appear to be quite singular. And more to the point, giraffe skin is pretty amazing. It is a beautiful multicolored skin. that would have been exceptionally rare and exotic in the time of the children of Israel. So a giraffe skin is not a bad contender to meet at least a few of the criteria. Now, he's going to go on and argue that that doesn't quite work. Shabbat 28b, our section of the Talmud that we looked at before, depicts the tachash as a species that existed in the days of Moses. That was made available to Moses for the specific purpose of use in construction of the tabernacle, and that was subsequently concealed. So he's arguing that a giraffe, we know what giraffes are. Should point out, however, that this idea that it was made available and then concealed could be interpreted not as it being removed from the world or made extinct, but simply that it was no longer common in that area of the world. I don't believe giraffes have ever been common in the area of Israel. However, whether or not it was possible that the trade might have brought giraffes or giraffe skins more commonly up to the north part of Africa, Egypt, or not, that is something that would be more interesting to investigate.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I read recently that giraffes used to roam wild in North Africa, Libya, Algeria. So certainly they would have been in Northern Africa because it is climatologically part of their range.
That's very interesting. I
So
hadn't realized that Africa at the time of the Exodus had a climate that would have supported them that far north. That's the great thing about research. It keeps discovering new things. So he goes on to explain the identification. The identification of the tachash with the giraffe is based on Targum Onkelos' translation of tachash as sas gavna, okay? Which would mean, if you were to translate that Aramaic, a creature that delights in its colors. And the Arabic meaning of the word zerafa, beautiful, which is, as you can see, quite likely related to the sas gavna, as well as the putative derivation of the Hebrew tachash from the verb chashosh, meaning to be silent, reflecting, at the time, the erroneous belief that the giraffe is mute. There were a lot of errors in the Middle Ages zoology of what people believed as sort of common wisdom about different animals. And one of the ones that was believed was that giraffes were mute. It's not true. They don't talk as much as other animals, perhaps, but they are absolutely able and do make sounds when they want to. However, it does make a linkage of the word usage if it was believed to be true. Sometimes that is enough to create a word connection. Again, much like the first people who saw a panda thought it was like a bear, and that's why it got labeled as a panda bear when it was first introduced into the English terminology. You would know that you were looking at the thing the first person called a panda because you could tell, yeah, actually they do kind of look like a bear. I could see why someone might make that mistake. Similarly, you might be able to understand why someone would make the mistake of thinking that giraffes were mute. Think back to all your visits to a zoo and tell me how many times you've heard a giraffe. It's very, very few, I'm sure, if ever. Okay, but this is going to bring us back full circle to the question of, well, if God was providing this animal, if the animal just wandered up, so to speak, then why couldn't all of the other things that are being requested just wander up? I mean, why did we need to have the gifts? Why were the people told to bring, if they wanted, a gift to help with the building of the Mishkan? Why not? Why didn't God just create a Home Depot in the middle of the wilderness that was stocked with everything that would be needed, and it would simply be able to be constructed from those materials right then and there? Or indeed, why not have the Mishkan already miraculously constructed, standing there in the middle of the wilderness, ready for when the Israelites arrived? why go through this laborious process and many, many chapters of descriptive details, not only telling us of how it was built, but also what everybody brought? Well, to understand at least the classical answer for that, we're going to turn our eyes to the Midrash. So going back to our first verse, that you shall accept from them not a donation of grain, wine, and oil, but gold, silver, and bronze. Again, meaning that there are these specifics that are being asked for, unlike the normal things that would be used for the running of the service. The Blessed Holy One said, I set up 13 things for you in Egypt. You too should offer 13. What's this talking about? The 13 which were done in Egypt are written down by Ezekiel. And this is going into the full section from Ezekiel. I clothed you with embroidered garments and gave you sandals of dolphin leather to wear and wound fine linen about your head and dressed you in silks. I decked you out in finery and put bracelets on your arms and a chain around your neck. I put a ring in your nose and earrings in your ears and a splendid crown on your head. The choice flour, the oil, and honey which I provided you to eat. So, based off Ezekiel's description of what God did for us as we were leaving Egypt, if you count that up, there are 13 things. And you too should offer 13 things, which if you go back and read our verses, here conveniently provided by the Midrash, you'll find gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, goat hairs, tanned ram skins, tachash skins, and acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil, and for the aromatic incense, lapis lazuli, and other stones for setting. So, lo and behold, we find that the 13 gifts that God gave us are now being reciprocated by our 13 gifts back to God. That there is an act here which shows a sense of gratitude. The fact that it's 13 and 13 is a nice coincidence, but more importantly, it is showing that when we give back to God, we are showing our gratitude for what God had given to us. Because indeed, the only things we can give back to God are those things which have been given to us. Yes, we work, and yes, we toil to earn that which we have, but ultimately, what we toil with, whether it be our body or resources, and how we toil with our own ingenuity and skill, these are gifts that were ultimately given to us. And so it is the capital by which we produce everything else in our life, and thus, essentially, God already has given us everything that we have, and giving back that to God makes perfect sense, because you realize you're not giving something that was wholly yours, you are giving something that was loaned to you during your time back to God, or rather in the service of God, since God doesn't need a big pile of gold somewhere. So this Midrash is bringing us back to the idea of when we build the Mishkan together, then God dwells among us, because we will be taking our shared sense of gratitude and our shared resources, which were given to us by God, and building a symbol of God's presence, which allows all of those things to be. And that becomes then a perpetuating cycle. The more we are aware of God, the more we are aware of God in our midst, the more we are aware of God's gifts, the more we are aware of how much we have benefited, the more likely we are to then turn around and share that in the service of God's commandments. Whether it be building the Mishkan, a one-time only activity, unfortunately, or whether it be supporting services, which happen more regularly, or whether it be in the fulfillment of all of the other commandments in our regular day-to-day life. That when we give to those in need, or when we choose not to cheat others, or not to steal, but instead to live only with what we've been given, we are recognizing that ultimately we should be grateful for the world that we have been given, the resources that we have, and that by leaving money on the table, in many cases because we are following the commandments, whether it be not working on a holiday and giving up that income, or whether it be helping somebody in need, or any of the other ways that being Jewish can cost us, that what we are really doing is to help build this Mishkan by giving back in exchange for the gifts that were given to us. Questions or comments before we get to one last and very different way of interpreting this covering? Okay. Last comment comes from Kedushat Levi, a great Hasidic teaching. Sometimes people make remarks in a joking fashion, although the deeper meaning of the remarks does reflect reverence for God. So he was a little confused, rhetorically confused, I will say. He wonders, how is it that people who are clearly devoted to God and of good character will sometimes waste time with frivolous jokes? They will say things that are clearly pointless, which, if you think about it, from a very technical point of view, humor is. It is not usually serving a practical function. So he wants to understand what's going on here when you have people that are clearly reverential of God making a joke. And he goes back to our skins. These skins of the tachash used as the outermost covering of the roof of the tabernacle symbolize this vernacular, this secular, which, though not valuable by itself, was put to good use as a cover, protection for the sacred content beneath the surface. When people known to revere God properly nonetheless indulge in joking remarks from time to time, this is not to be understood as a lack of reverence for God, but is meant to make the substance of their remarks, which are designed to bring people closer to God, more readily acceptable, as their listeners respond to jokes immediately. So hopefully his meaning is clear here, but he's trying to say that when you use humor in the right way, you often make the message more understandable, more relatable, and more acceptable to people that are perhaps not yet ready to hear it without a bit of a chuckle. And humor does have a way of sometimes opening up understanding and opening up people's vulnerability to the message that is being shared. And so humor is not an opposition to reverential speech. Sometimes it is a very necessary assistance to reverential speech. The same way that this tachash, this special, perhaps flamboyant covering of the top of the Mishkan, wasn't there to distract from the Mishkan, but it was there to draw attention to it, to get people to marvel at it, and to bring their focus to that centerpiece of our ancestral encampment during that time period. So sometimes what might look like a distraction can in fact be a direction in the point of direction towards the right idea. Questions or comments before we finish up for today?
I guess I'm not sure if I understand that last commentary.
Mm-hmm.
Is it kind of like, sometimes you have to get muddy to help people out of the mud, that having this impure outer covering is a way to, I guess as he's saying, bring attention, but a way to connect with the people so that on the outside it's not pure, but inside it is.
I don't think he's arguing for impurity of content. I mean, he certainly would not be a fan, and neither am I, of offensive or off-color jokes. But in his day, there were many people who argued puritanically against humor. And indeed, there are still people to this day who argue that humor is pointless, it's extraneous. What are you doing except wasting the little time that you have on Earth with a bit of humor? You should only be talking about very serious, God-centered things. I think the comparison he's trying to make here is that the tachash, the covering, also seemed extraneous. We already have a leather cover over the Mishkan itself. Why do we need an additional covering on top, especially this tachash one? And he's saying, well, because it served a purpose. Yes, it didn't serve the purpose of keeping the rain off, that was already covered by the basic leather, but it did serve another purpose, to bring people's attention and focus in. And that purpose, extraneous though it may be, and perhaps even unnecessary in some ideal puritanical world though it may be, is a very real and good purpose in the world that we actually live in, you know, the real world, where humor is often a very important assistant for good teaching and helping people find the Torah and Judaism accessible. So never be ashamed of making a good joke in the service of a good reason. Bad jokes, well, you know, we're not all perfect. I certainly made a fair number of my own. Offensive and rude jokes, yeah, that's off the table. All right, everyone, thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day and continue to study this section of the Torah with as much passion as you do the more attractive passages, which lend themselves more easily to understanding. Use the commentaries and you will find that there are hidden gems throughout that will hopefully keep you moving forward verse by verse, chapter by chapter, as we get through what can still sometimes feel like difficult material, but nonetheless is very worthwhile. Take care and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.